The autumn wind of 1912 carried the scent of juniper and mesquite across the McKinnon Ranch as Dr. William Morrison guided his medical bag up the weathered porch steps. At 73, Ezekiel McKinnon still possessed the silent strength of a man who had learned survival from the mountains themselves, but the persistent ache in his left shoulder had finally prompted his nephew Timothy to summon medical attention. Dr. Morrison, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had recently established practice in the growing town of Tucson, found himself immediately struck by the ranch's austere beauty. The log cabin, built with the defensive instincts of a man who understood danger, commanded a clear view of the Chiricahua Mountains rising like ancient sentinels against the desert sky. Handmade tools hung from the workshop walls, their craftsmanship speaking of decades spent in self-reliance far from civilization's reach. "Mr. McKinnon, Doctor," Morrison said as he entered the sparsely furnished main room, his eyes drawn to the corner shrine where faded photographs of a woman and two children shared space with images of a younger man in work clothes. "Your nephew Timothy expressed concern about your shoulder. When did you first notice the discomfort?" Ezekiel settled into a chair carved from oak, his weathered hands folding with the patience of a man accustomed to measuring time by seasons rather than hours. The morning light, filtering through windows positioned to observe all approaches to the ranch, illuminated the network of scars that mapped a lifetime of survival across his arms and hands. "The shoulder's been talking to me for months now, Doc," Ezekiel replied, his voice carrying the careful cadence of a man who had learned to make words count. "But it's an old complaint. Bullet wound from an Apache arrow that found its mark 27 years ago." Morrison opened his medical bag, withdrawing the tools of his trade with practiced efficiency. As he began his examination, probing gently at the shoulder joint, he noticed how Ezekiel's cabin seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. No electric lights, no modern conveniences, just the essential tools of mountain living arranged with military precision. "This scarring suggests significant trauma," Dr. Morrison observed, his fingers tracing the old wound. "You're fortunate to have retained full mobility. The healing shows skilled medical attention." A distant look entered Ezekiel's eyes, as if the doctor's touch had awakened memories that preferred to sleep. "Apache medicine woman worked on that shoulder, Doc. Best healing I ever saw, though I never expected kindness from that quarter." The statement hung in the air between them, laden with implications that made Dr. Morrison pause in his examination. He had heard stories about the Apache Wars, tales of brutality on both sides that had shaped the territory's bloody history. But something in Ezekiel's tone suggested a more complex narrative. "An Apache woman treated your wounds?" Dr. Morrison asked, his professional curiosity kindled. "That seems unusual given the conflicts of that era." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling to the photographs on the shrine. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, filled with the weight of unspoken history. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the timbre of a man preparing to unlock doors that had remained closed for decades. 27 years ago, Doc, I learned that some wounds heal bodies and some heal souls. The Apache woman who saved this shoulder also saved something more valuable that I thought I'd lost forever." Dr. Morrison completed his examination, noting the remarkable flexibility for a man of Ezekiel's years. "Your shoulder shows excellent healing, though I suspect you'll feel weather changes for the rest of your days. But I find myself more curious about the woman who provided such skilled treatment." The wind outside shifted, carrying with it the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk. Ezekiel's hands found the smooth wood of his chair arms, fingers tracing patterns worn by years of contemplation. The afternoon sun slanted lower through the windows, painting golden rectangles across the cabin floor. "You have time for a long story, Doc?" Ezekiel asked, his eyes holding depths that spoke of experiences beyond the normal measure of men. "Because what happened in 1885 changed everything I thought I knew about family, justice, and what it means to save a life." Dr. Morrison found himself settling deeper into his own chair, medical bag forgotten at his feet. Something in Ezekiel's manner suggested that he was about to hear a tale that would challenge everything he thought he understood about the Apache Wars and the men who fought them. "I have all the time you need, Mr. McKinnon." Ezekiel nodded slowly, his gaze traveling once more to the photographs of his lost family. "Then let me tell you about the summer I was 46 years old, raising my orphaned nephew Timothy, and discovered that sometimes saving one Apache woman can save your own soul. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows as if the very mountains were preparing to bear witness to the story about to unfold. In the summer of 1885, Ezekiel McKinnon carried sorrows that weighed heavier than any pack he had shouldered during his decades as a mountainman. The ranch that had become his refuge sat nestled in the foothills of the Chiricahua Mountains, its log walls built thick enough to stop bullets and positioned to command views of all approaches. But no fortress, however well constructed, could keep out the ghosts that visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. Margaret O'Brien McKinnon smiled at him from the daguerreotype on the corner shrine, her teacher's intelligence bright in eyes that had seen promise in a weathered mountainman's soul. She had come west from Boston in 1875, bringing books and determination to Arizona Territory's scattered settlements. Ezekiel had never imagined that such a woman could find anything worthy in a man whose hands were stained with beaver blood and Apache tears. Their children, Sarah and David, flanked their mother in the photograph taken just months before the consumption claimed all three. Sarah, at 5 years old, had possessed her mother's quick mind and her father's stubborn courage. David, barely 3, had followed his sister everywhere with the devoted loyalty that Ezekiel now recognized in his nephew Timothy. The memory of their laughter still echoed through the cabin's rooms like music from a time when the world had made sense. "Chew, Ezekiel," Timothy's voice called from the workshop, using the Vietnamese word for uncle that had somehow become natural between them. The elk tracks lead toward Devil's Anvil Mesa again. Timothy McKinnon, 8 years old and wise beyond his years, appeared in the cabin doorway with dirt on his knees and excitement bright in his dark eyes. The boy had inherited his father Samuel's quick intelligence and his grandfather's gift for reading the land. Since Samuel's death in the mining accident 2 years past, Timothy had become both Ezekiel's greatest joy and his deepest fear. "Same elk we've been tracking for 3 days?" Ezekiel asked, rising from the kitchen table where he had been cleaning his Spencer rifle. The weapon, like everything else in his possession, showed the meticulous care of a man who understood that survival depended on reliable tools. "Yes, sir. Big bull with the notched antler. His trail's fresh from this morning." Ezekiel studied his nephew's eager face, seeing in it echoes of the children he had failed to save. The protective instincts that had failed him when consumption crept through his family's lungs now focused with laser intensity on this last precious connection to blood and memory. "We'll follow the trail, but only if you remember the rules," Ezekiel said, reaching for his buckskin jacket. "What are they?" Timothy straightened with the seriousness of a recruit receiving orders. "Stay close enough to hear your whistle. Watch where I step. Keep my rifle loaded but not cocked. If you say hide, I hide until you come for me." The rules had been carved into Timothy's consciousness through repetition and explanation. Ezekiel had seen too much of death's random cruelty to take chances with the last member of his family. The boy would learn mountainman skills, but he would learn them safely. They set out under the climbing sun, following the elk's trail through landscape that changed from pine-studded foothills to the harsh beauty of high desert. Ezekiel moved with the unconscious grace of a man who had spent 30 years reading terrain for survival, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of danger. Timothy followed close behind, absorbing lessons with the intensity of a child who understood that knowledge meant survival. "Chew," Timothy said quietly as they paused at a stream crossing. "Why do the tracks show the elk favoring his right front leg?" Ezekiel smiled despite himself. The boy's observation skills grew sharper each month. "Look at the depth of the prints, Timothy. Wait, what do you see? Left front hoof sinks deeper. He's putting more weight on it. Right, old injury, probably from fighting during rutting season, makes him predictable, which makes him catchable." They pressed deeper into the wilderness, following game trails that few white men had ever seen. This was Apache country, though most of the tribes had been driven south or confined to reservations. Still, Ezekiel's senses remained alert to possibilities that went beyond natural predators. The land itself held memories of violence. These mountains had witnessed countless skirmishes during the Apache Wars, brief explosive encounters that left men dead and families destroyed on both sides. Ezekiel had participated in enough of these battles to understand that courage and brutality often shared the same face. As they climbed toward Devil's Anvil Mesa, a massive flat-topped formation that dominated the landscape for miles around, Timothy suddenly stopped. His young face showed the concentrated attention that Ezekiel had learned to respect. Chew, why are the birds flying wrong? Ezekiel immediately focused on the sky above them. A kettle of turkey vultures wheeled in tight circles, but their usual lazy patterns seemed disrupted, agitated. Ravens called with harsh urgency from ridgetops, their voices carrying warnings that spoke to instincts older than civilization. Something's disturbing the natural order, Ezekiel said quietly, his hand moving instinctively to check his rifle. Animals know when death is near. The elk trail led them steadily upward, but Ezekiel's attention had shifted from hunting to survival. 30 years of mountain living had taught him to trust the language of wildlife above all other forms of intelligence. When animals showed fear, wise men listened. The mesa's shadow fell across them as they approached its base, providing welcome relief from the climbing heat. But something in the quality of the silence made Ezekiel's skin crawl with premonitions he could not name. "Timothy," he said softly, "remember the rules." The boy nodded, his young face growing serious as he recognized the change in his uncle's demeanor. They had practiced for moments like this, though Ezekiel prayed they would never face real danger together. As they rounded a massive boulder formation, following the elk's trail toward the mesa's upper slopes, the silence became absolute. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no rustle of small animals in the brush. The world held its breath as if witnessing something that violated natural law. And then Ezekiel saw her. On the flat expanse of Devil's Anvil Mesa, under the merciless hammer of Arizona's heat, a young Apache woman lay spread-eagle against the red stone. Her wrists and ankles were bound to iron stakes driven deep into the rock. Her buckskin dress darkened with sweat and blood where the ropes had cut into her flesh. She had been exposed to the elements for what Ezekiel's experienced eye estimated as 3 full days. "Dear God," he breathed, the sight hitting him like a physical blow. Timothy gasped beside him, his young mind struggling to process the deliberate cruelty laid out before them. "Chew, what is that? What happened to her?" Ezekiel's mind immediately cataloged the woman's condition with the clinical precision of a man who had treated countless injuries in the wilderness. Severe dehydration, evident from the sunken quality around her eyes and the cracked condition of her lips. Sun poisoning across exposed skin, turning it an angry red that spoke of hours under the relentless desert heat. Rope burns at wrists and ankles where she had struggled against her bonds. Most telling of all, she was still alive. Her chest rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of someone clinging to life through sheer will. In Ezekiel's experience, survival under these conditions for 3 days bordered on miraculous. "It's called desert trial," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice heavy with knowledge he wished he did not possess. "Some communities use it when they believe someone has committed an unforgivable crime. If the accused survives 3 days under the sun, they're considered innocent. If they die, the desert has rendered its judgment." The explanation tasted bitter in his mouth. He had seen this form of execution before, during his scouting days, and had always turned away from communities that practiced such barbarity. But turning away was easier when the victim was a stranger glimpsed from a distance. "Is she going to die?" Timothy asked, his voice small with horror. Ezekiel studied the woman more carefully, noting details that spoke to his mountain man's instincts. Her buckskin clothing showed quality workmanship, decorated with beadwork that suggested high status within her tribe. Her hair, despite 3 days of exposure, retained the careful braiding that indicated cultural pride. Most remarkably, her face showed no signs of the madness that usually claimed desert trial victims before death. "Not if I can help it," he said, making a decision that he knew would change everything. "Timothy, I need you to watch the approaches while I cut her loose. Anyone comes up that trail, you whistle once, soft and low." "But Chew, what if she's dangerous? What if she really did something bad?" The question stopped Ezekiel cold, forcing him to examine his own motivations. Why was he willing to risk Timothy's safety for an Apache stranger? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity, because leaving her to die would make him complicit in murder, and he had seen enough death to last several lifetimes. "Timothy," he said carefully, "sometimes the law and justice point in different directions. When that happens, a man has to choose which voice he'll follow." He approached the bound woman slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. At the sound of his footsteps on stone, her eyes opened. Despite the extremity of her condition, her gaze held steady intelligence, and the kind of courage that Ezekiel recognized in warriors. Water, she whispered in clear, unaccented English. Please, mountain man, help me. The words hit Ezekiel like a thunderbolt. Not only did she speak perfect English, but she had recognized him as a mountain man. In his experience, Apache rarely spoke the white man's language with such fluency, and they certainly didn't identify mountain men by sight. You know what I am, he said, kneeling beside her to examine the ropes more closely. I know the clothes, the way you move, the respect you show for land, she replied, her voice gaining strength from the shade his body provided. Mountain men understand survival. They help others who fight to live. Ezekiel began working at the rope binding her right wrist, his knife blade sawing carefully through fibers baked hard by the desert sun. The hemp had been tied with professional competence, designed to prevent escape while ensuring a slow death. What's your name? He asked as he worked. Ayana. It means eternal blossom in my language. What are you accused of, Ayana? Her laugh held no humor, only exhaustion and bitter understanding. Poisoning the wells of Crimson Wells, killing 15 children with Apache magic, being Apache when children die, and white men need someone to blame. The rope parted under his blade, and blood began flowing back into her hand with painful intensity. Ezekiel immediately began work on her left wrist while Timothy maintained his watch from the mesa's edge. Did you poison their wells? Ezekiel asked. I warned them their wells were poisoned, she replied. I told them to stop drinking the water, to find new sources. For this warning, they decided I was witch. Something in her tone convinced Ezekiel that he was hearing truth. After 30 years of reading men's hearts through their voices, he had developed instincts about honesty that rarely failed him. This woman spoke with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose and no reason for deception. As he freed her second hand, she immediately began rubbing circulation back into her arms with movements that spoke of medical knowledge. You risk much helping, Apache woman. Mountain man. Why? The question echoed Timothy's concern, but Ezekiel found himself answering with honesty that surprised him. Because I've lost everyone I ever loved, and I won't stand by and watch another person die when I have power to prevent it. He moved to work on her ankle bonds, noting that her feet showed the swelling and discoloration of restricted circulation. Without immediate treatment, she could lose the ability to walk even if she survived. Chew, Timothy called softly from his lookout position. Riders coming up the trail, 8 men, moving fast. Ezekiel's blood turned to ice water. He recognized the sound Timothy described, the purposeful approach of men accustomed to violence. The ropes around Ayana's ankles seemed to mock his efforts, still thick and defiant under his knife blade. How long? He called back. Maybe 5 minutes to reach the mesa. Ayana looked directly into Ezekiel's eyes, her gaze holding depths of courage that reminded him powerfully of Margaret during her final illness. Leave me, mountain man. Save the boy. This is not your fight. Instead, Ezekiel redoubled his efforts with the knife, his movements becoming urgent but not careless. Timothy, how many men can you count? 8 riders, 1 wearing black coat like Judge. They have rifles. The second ankle rope parted just as the sound of approaching horses became clearly audible from below. Ezekiel helped Ayana to a sitting position, noting how she bit back cries of pain as feeling returned to her extremities. Can you walk? He asked urgently. If walking means living, I can walk, she replied. At that moment, Timothy watched the interaction between Ezekiel and Ayana with the same focused attention he had brought to their earlier conversations about Apache culture. His previous demonstration of halting Apache words had already established his curiosity about the people he had been taught to consider enemies. And now that curiosity was evolving into something deeper, genuine respect for knowledge that transcended cultural boundaries. The approaching horses grew louder, their hoofbeats echoing off the mesa walls with the rhythm of approaching judgment. Ezekiel helped Ayana to her feet, noting how she tested her weight carefully before trusting her legs to support her. There's a hidden trail down the backside, she said, nodding toward the mesa's rear edge. Apache hunting path. Your horses cannot follow there. We didn't bring horses, Ezekiel replied grimly. We're on foot. Then we use mountain ways, she said, her voice growing stronger. You know this country? Like my own heartbeat. The first riders appeared at the mesa's edge just as Ezekiel, Timothy, and Ayana reached the concealment of a boulder field. Through gaps in the stone, they could see a tall man in a black coat and string tie dismounting with the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed. Judge Mordecai Blackwater, Aitana whispered. He owns the silver mine. He owns everything. Blackwater's voice carried clearly across the mesa as he surveyed the cut ropes and bloodstains. McKinnon, I know you're out there. Your mountain savagery doesn't apply to civilized justice. Ezekiel felt Timothy press close against his side, the boy's small hand finding the comfort of his uncle's buckskin jacket. In that moment, Ezekiel understood that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. By saving Ayanna, he had declared himself an enemy of whatever authority Blackwater represented. You have boy with you, McKinnon, Blackwater continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who held all the advantages. Boy needs proper education about respecting law and order. The threat to Timothy ignited something primal in Ezekiel's chest. He had failed to protect Margaret, Sarah, and David. He had been absent when consumption claimed them. But Timothy lived and breathed beside him, and no power on earth would take this last precious remnant of his family. This way, Ayanna whispered, indicating a narrow cleft in the rocks that seemed to lead directly into the mesa's heart. Sacred place, they will not follow. As they moved deeper into the hidden passages, Timothy looked back toward where Blackwater's men were spreading out to search. Chew, are we outlaws now? Ezekiel considered the question with the gravity it deserved. By any legal standard, he had just interfered with the execution of a judicial sentence. He had made himself a fugitive and turned his nephew into one as well. Sometimes, Timothy, he said quietly as they followed Ayanna into the darkness of the sacred cave, being right and being legal are two different things. Today, we chose to be right. The sound of their pursuers faded as they moved deeper into the mountain's embrace. But Ezekiel knew that this was only the beginning. Judge Blackwater did not seem like a man who would accept defiance lightly, and the game they had just begun would demand everything Ezekiel had learned about survival. But as he looked at Ayanna's face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, he saw something that reminded him of better times. Hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that someone had chosen to care whether she lived or died. For the first time in years, Ezekiel McKinnon felt like he was fighting for something rather than simply surviving another day. The cave system that Ayanna led them through seemed to exist outside the normal rules of geography. Passages curved and branched with the organic logic of water-wearing stone over countless centuries. Their walls decorated with Apache symbols that spoke of generations of spiritual use. Timothy moved with the quick adaptability of childhood, his small size an advantage in passages where Ezekiel had to duck or turn sideways. This place is holy to my people, Ayanna explained, as they paused at a junction where three tunnels converged. For centuries, vision seekers came here to speak with spirits of the mountain. The air carried the cool dampness of deep stone, offering blessed relief from the desert heat above. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, the sound of running water promised the spring that made extended hiding possible. Ezekiel's mountain man instincts cataloged details automatically. Good ventilation, multiple escape routes, natural fortification that could be defended by a single person with good positioning. How far does this system extend? He asked, noting how Ayanna moved through the darkness with the confidence of intimate familiarity. Miles. Comes out near the base of Thunder Peak, another opening by Willow Creek. My grandmother brought me here as child, taught me the old ways. They emerged into a larger chamber where filtered sunlight fell through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a natural amphitheater carved by underground streams. A pool of clear water reflected dancing light patterns onto walls covered with pictographs depicting human figures, animals, and symbols whose meanings were lost to all but the Apache. Timothy immediately knelt by the water, cupping his hands to drink after asking permission with a glance at Ayanna. The courtesy pleased her. She nodded approval and settled carefully onto a flat stone that served as a natural seat. Boy has good manners for nephew of mountain man, she said, wincing as blood flow returned fully to her extremities. Ezekiel began examining her injuries with the clinical attention of someone who had treated countless wounds in wilderness conditions. The rope burns were deep but clean, without signs of infection that could prove fatal. The sun damage was severe but would heal with time and proper care. Most concerning was the dehydration, which had progressed nearly to the point of organ failure. Drink slowly, he instructed as Timothy brought her water cupped in his small hands. Your body needs time to remember how to process water. While Ayana rehydrated, Ezekiel explored the chamber's defensive possibilities. The entrance they had used was narrow enough that a single armed man could hold it against significant numbers. Food could be obtained through hunting, and the spring provided unlimited fresh water. If necessary, they could survive here for weeks. Chew Ezekiel, Timothy said quietly, settling beside his uncle on another stone seat. Why do people do that to other people? Tie them up to die in the sun? The question carried the weight of a child encountering evil for the first time. Ezekiel found himself struggling to explain human cruelty to someone who still believed the world made sense. Fear makes people do terrible things, Timothy. When children die and parents can't understand why, they look for someone to blame. Sometimes they choose the wrong target. But she's just a woman. How could she hurt children? She couldn't, Ayana said from her position by the water. I came to Crimson Wells to help sick children, not hurt them. But helping meant telling truth about poisoned water, and truth threatened powerful men. Ezekiel studied her face in the dancing light, noting details that spoke of education and culture. Her English showed the precision of formal schooling, not the broken phrases typical of Apache, who had learned the white man's language through casual contact. Her clothing, despite its current condition, showed the fine workmanship of someone with resources and status. You're not what people expect in an Apache woman, he observed. I was educated at Carlisle Indian School, then continued studies at Mission School in Santa Fe. Learned white medicine to go with Apache healing knowledge. Thought I could help both peoples. What brought you back to this country? My grandfather was Chief Cochise. My grandmother was medicine woman who knew us all the old ways. When they died, knowledge died with them unless someone carries it forward. She touched the beadwork on her dress with reverence. I came back to preserve what could be saved, to help our people survive in the white world without losing themselves completely. Timothy listened with the fascination of a child discovering that the world contained complexities beyond his previous understanding. You're really Chief Cochise's granddaughter? I am, though that means little now that our people live on reservations and our warriors have been broken. The sadness in her voice resonated with Ezekiel's own losses, creating an unexpected bridge of understanding. They were both survivors carrying the weight of destroyed families and vanished ways of life. The children who died, he said carefully, what really killed them? Poison in the water, but not Apache poison. Something that comes from silver mining, makes water taste sweet but brings death to those who drink it. Mercury, Ezekiel said immediately. I've seen it before at mining camps. Miners use it to separate silver from ore, and it runs off into water sources. Children die first because their bodies can't fight the poison. Ayana nodded grimly. I tested water with plants my grandmother taught me to use. Everything died when exposed to spring water from town. I told them, stop drinking it, find new source. Judge Blackwater became very angry. Blackwater owns the silver mine? Biggest mine in territory. Makes much money but cares nothing for poison it creates. The pieces began falling together in Ezekiel's mind with the clarity of a puzzle revealing its solution. Ayana had discovered that Blackwater's mining operation was contaminating the town's water supply. Rather than accept responsibility for the deaths, Blackwater had framed her for murder using Apache witchcraft as his explanation. Where's the evidence, he asked. Anything that proves the water contamination? Hidden in my medicine bag, along with samples of poisoned water and plants that died from contact. But bag is with my horse, somewhere near Crimson Wells. Then we need to get it back. Chew, Timothy said carefully. That sounds dangerous. Ezekiel ruffled his nephew's hair with affection complicated by worry. The boy was right to be concerned. Returning to Crimson Wells would mean walking into a town controlled by a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to commit murder to protect his interests. But leaving Ayana's evidence unclaimed meant that her story would never be believed. Without proof, she would remain a fugitive, and Blackwater would continue poisoning children while blaming Apache magic for their deaths. Sometimes doing the right thing requires taking risks, he told Timothy. The question is whether we're willing to take those risks to help someone who can't help herself. Before Timothy could respond, the sound of voices echoed from deep within the cave system. distant and distorted by stone passages, but unmistakably human in getting closer. They found the entrance, Ayana said, rising despite her obvious pain. We need to move. How many other ways out? Ezekiel asked, checking his rifle and estimating ammunition. 2 that lead to surface, 3 more that go deeper into mountain. But if they bring many men, they can watch all exits. Ezekiel's mind raced through tactical possibilities. Blackwater clearly commanded significant resources and had no intention of allowing them to escape. The cave system provided temporary sanctuary, but it could also become a trap if surrounded. Timothy, he said, remember what we practiced about hiding and staying quiet? Yes, sir. Good, because we're about to find out if Judge Blackwater is as committed to justice as he claims to be. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the sound of boots on stone and the metallic clatter of weapons being readied. Ezekiel positioned himself where he could watch the main entrance while maintaining clear fields of fire through the chamber. Ayana, he said quietly, if something happens to me, you get Timothy out of here. Use your knowledge of these caves and keep him safe. Nothing will happen, she replied with quiet conviction. Mountain spirits protect those who defend innocence. Whether her words carried the weight of Apache spirituality or simple human determination, Ezekiel found them oddly comforting. As the sound of approaching men grew louder, he settled into the patient alertness that had kept him alive through 30 years of wilderness survival. Whatever came next, he would not make the mistake he had made with Margaret, Sarah, and David. This time, he would be present when his family needed protection. The first shadow appeared at the cave entrance just as Timothy's small hand found his uncle's arm, offering the silent support that can exist only between people who have chosen to face danger together. In that moment, surrounded by ancient Apache spirits and threatened by modern injustice, Ezekiel McKinnon felt more alive than he had since his wife's death 7 years before. The battle for justice was about to begin. The voices faded as their pursuers retreated from the cave's depths, defeated by the labyrinthine passages that had protected Apache's secrets for generations. Ezekiel waited a full hour after the last echo died before allowing himself to relax his vigilant watch. Timothy had remained motionless throughout the ordeal, demonstrating the kind of discipline that would serve him well in the trials ahead. They're gone, Iana confirmed, returning from a scouting expedition through passages too narrow for a grown man to follow. But they left men watching the main entrances. We are trapped but safe. The irony was not lost on Ezekiel. They had gained sanctuary at the cost of freedom, trading immediate danger for the slower threat of starvation. But the cave system offered resources that a lifetime of mountain living had taught him to recognize and exploit. Chew Ezekiel, Timothy said, breaking the contemplative silence. Miss Ayana looks very sick still. The boy's observation was accurate. Despite the water and shade, Ayana showed the lingering effects of 3 days under the relentless heat. Her hands trembled with the fine tremor of severe dehydration, and her movements carried the careful precision of someone fighting constant pain. Timothy's right, Ezekiel said, studying Ayana with the clinical eye of a wilderness medic. You need proper treatment, not just water and rest. I know Apache remedies for sun sickness, she replied, but the plants I need don't grow in caves. Apache remedies maybe, but mountain remedies work just as well. Ezekiel began exploring the cave system's botanical resources, using knowledge accumulated through decades of wilderness survival. Near the underground stream, he found wild willow whose inner bark could reduce fever and pain. In crevices where filtered sunlight reached stone, hardy moss provided natural antiseptic properties. The combination of Apache's spiritual sanctuary and mountain practical knowledge created possibilities that neither tradition could achieve alone. Timothy, gather dry wood from the passage floors, Ezekiel instructed. Small pieces only, the kind that burn without much smoke. While Timothy collected fuel, Ezekiel prepared medicinal compounds using techniques learned from a dozen different sources. Army field medics, tribal healers, mountain men who had survived injuries that would have killed softer people. The process required time and attention, but it gave him something constructive to focus on while they waited for Blackwater's interest to move elsewhere. Most children his age would be crying from fear. Timothy's seen enough loss to understand that crying doesn't change circumstances, Ezekiel replied, arranging the wood for a small, smokeless fire. His parents died when he was 6. He's learned that survival depends on keeping your head when everything goes wrong. Like you learned when your wife and children died? The question caught Ezekiel off guard with its directness. He looked up from the fire preparation to find Ayana studying him with the same clinical attention he had been giving her injuries. Timothy told me while you were scouting the passages, she explained, said his uncle carried sadness like Apache warriors carry war paint, something that marks them but doesn't define them. Timothy talks too much sometimes, Ezekiel said, but without real irritation. He talks like someone who loves his family and wants to understand their pain. The fire caught, filling the chamber with warm light that transformed the ancient pictographs into living story. Timothy settled between the two adults with the unconscious trust of a child who had never doubted his uncle's ability to keep him safe. Chew, he said quietly, can I ask Miss Ayana about Apache words? I want to learn them right, not just guess from listening. Ayana's face brightened with the first genuine pleasure she had shown since her rescue. What words do you want to know, young mountain man? Words for family, for people who choose to stay together even when they're not born together. The question seemed to resonate with both adults, touching on themes that had shaped their recent experiences. Ayana considered carefully before responding, her voice taking on the rhythm of teaching. In Apache, we say goshk for family that shares blood. But we also say Ndi Nalnish for people who choose to become family through shared experience and loyalty. It means people who live together in heart. Ndi Nalnish, Timothy repeated, working carefully with the pronunciation. People who live together in heart. You learn quickly. Your tongue finds Apache sounds better than most white children. As the medicinal tea steeped over the fire, Ezekiel found himself studying this Apache woman who spoke with a teacher's patience and demonstrated knowledge that bridged two worlds. Her education was evident not just in her English fluency, but in the way she approached problems with systematic intelligence. Tell me about Carlisle School, he said, offering her the first cup of willow bark tea. Not many Apache children get that kind of education. My grandmother arranged it. She understood that our people needed members who could speak with white world on equal terms. Ayana sipped the tea gratefully, her expression softening as the natural painkiller began its work. 10 years learning white ways, then 5 years learning how to use that knowledge to help my people. But you came back to traditional healing. White medicine treats symptoms. Apache medicine treats causes. Best healing uses both approaches together. She demonstrated by examining the rope burns on her wrists with professional competence, applying Ezekiel's willow bark preparation while explaining how Apache techniques would complement the mountain man's treatment. In my tribe, healers learn to read the whole person, not just the injury. Your nephew carries worry that goes deeper than fear for his own safety. He worries for you, for how much sadness you hold inside. Ezekiel glanced at Timothy, who was practicing Apache words under his breath with the concentration he brought to all learning. The boy's too young to carry adult burdens. Maybe. Or maybe he understands that healing happens when people share burdens instead of carrying them alone. The conversation was interrupted by Timothy's excited whisper. Chew, I figured out something about Miss Ayana's medicine bag. Both adults turned toward him with immediate attention. When you talked about mercury poisoning, I remembered something. Last month when we traded supplies in town, I saw men loading barrels onto wagons near Judge Blackwater's mining office. The barrels had marks like skull symbols, and they smelled like metal. Ezekiel felt his pulse quicken. Mercury shipment. They use it to extract silver from ore, but it's deadly poison if it gets into water supplies. And Judge Blackwater controls the mine that's upstream from the town's main spring, Ayana added, her voice growing stronger as the implications became clear. So the children didn't die from Apache magic, Timothy said, working through the logic with the precision that made him such an effective student. They died because someone was careless with poison. Not careless, Ezekiel corrected grimly. Deliberate. Blackwater knew his mining operation was contaminating the water supply, and he needed a scapegoat when people started dying. The picture that emerged was more sinister than simple prejudice or fear. Blackwater had orchestrated a systematic cover-up that required Ayana's death to succeed. Her knowledge of traditional plant medicine had allowed her to identify the contamination, making her a threat to his entire operation. There's something else, Ayana said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Before they tied me to the mesa, I overheard conversations. Judge Blackwater spoke of other deaths, other people who asked questions about the water. What kind of other people? Apache workers at the mine, Mexican families who complained about sick children, a white settler who demanded water testing. Her eyes held depths of anger that spoke to systematic murder rather than isolated incidents. All died in accidents or disappeared into desert, all who threatened to expose truth about poisoned water. Ezekiel absorbed this information with the grim recognition of someone who had seen human evil in its purest forms. Blackwater wasn't just covering up environmental contamination. He was operating a murder conspiracy that crossed racial and cultural boundaries. How many people know the real truth? He asked. Before capture, I told my story to Dr. Edmund Hayes, the town physician. Also to Maria Santos, Mexican woman whose husband died in mining accident. Maybe others believed, maybe they were too frightened to speak. Then we need to reach these people, gather evidence, expose Blackwater's operation. Chuka Timothy said carefully, doesn't that mean going back to town where all the dangerous people are? The question highlighted the central dilemma of their situation. Staying hidden kept them alive, but left Blackwater free to continue killing. Emerging from sanctuary meant risking capture, but offered the possibility of justice. Sometimes, Ezekiel said slowly, the most dangerous thing you can do is the right thing. But that doesn't mean you should avoid doing it. As if summoned by their conversation about danger, the sound of approaching voices echoed through the cave system once again. But this time, the voices spoke Apache rather than English, and their tone carried urgency rather than threat. Ayanna rose quickly despite her injuries, moving toward the sound with sudden hope. My cousin Broken Arrow. He was scout for Army, but retired to reservation. If he found us, maybe he brings help. The reunion that followed filled the cave with rapid Apache conversation that Timothy struggled to follow, but Ezekiel recognized as the sound of relief and planning. Broken Arrow, a weathered man in his 50s whose face bore the geometric tattoos of traditional warrior status, had tracked them through terrain that had defeated Blackwater's men. When the conversation shifted to English for the benefit of their white allies, the news proved both encouraging and alarming. Blackwater has put bounty on all three, Broken Arrow reported. $500 each, dead or alive. Half the territory will be looking for you by tomorrow. Any word about the evidence in Ayanna's medicine bag? Ezekiel asked. Gone. Blackwater's men found horse in bag first day. Whatever proof existed, it's destroyed now. The loss hit them like a physical blow. Without tangible evidence of the water contamination, they had only their word against that of a powerful man with economic and political influence. Then we have to create new evidence, Ezekiel said after a moment of silence. Test the water ourselves, document the contamination, gather witnesses who can't be intimidated. That means leaving safety of sacred places, Broken Arrow observed. Once you enter White World again, you become targets. We're targets anyway, Ayanna replied with quiet determination. At least this way, we die fighting for truth instead of hiding from lies. Timothy moved closer to his uncle, his young face showing the gravity of someone who understood that their childhood phase of relative safety was ending. What can I do to help? He asked. The question revealed the courage that ran in McKinnon blood, but it also highlighted the impossible position of involving a child in adult dangers. You can do the most important job of all, Ezekiel told him. You can be the bridge between different peoples, helping them understand each other instead of fighting. As plans began to take shape around the flickering fire, surrounded by Apache spiritual symbols and blessed by mountain wisdom, Ezekiel felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders. They were no longer simply hiding from injustice. They were preparing to confront it directly. But first, they had to survive the transition from sanctuary to battlefield, where the rules would be written by men like Judge Blackwater, who understood only the language of power and profit. The strategy session that followed Broken Arrow's arrival revealed the scope of opposition they faced. Blackwater controlled not only the silver mine and most of Crimson Well's business interests, but also maintained a private army of gunmen who operated with the implicit approval of territorial authorities. 12 full-time fighters, Broken Arrow reported, drawing a rough map in the cave's sandy floor. Plus maybe 20 part-time men who work for bounty money, all armed with new rifles, all experienced with killing. What about legal authority? Ezekiel asked. Territorial marshal, federal agents, anyone who might listen to evidence? Nearest federal marshal is 3 days' ride in Tucson. Territorial law in this region basically belongs to whoever has most guns and money. The picture that emerged was of a frontier community held hostage by economic power backed by violence. Blackwater had created a system where opposition meant death, and death could always be blamed on Apache raiders, bandits, or tragic accidents. There's more, Broken Arrow continued. Word is spreading about Apache woman with powerful medicine who cursed children to death. People are frightened, angry. Some families have lost children, and grief makes them dangerous. Untie absorbed this news with the stoic acceptance of someone who had expected no better from the white community. They need someone to blame for their pain. Apache witch makes perfect target. Not if we can prove the real cause of their children's deaths, Ezekiel said. Parents who discover their children were murdered by greed instead of magic might be willing to listen to truth. Maybe, or maybe they kill messenger who brings bad news they don't want to hear. Timothy had been listening to the adult conversation with the concentrated attention he brought to all learning opportunities. The boy who had already surprised them with his linguistic curiosity now demonstrated the same analytical thinking. Chew Ezekiel, what if we could prove the water is poisoned by showing people instead of just telling them? The suggestion sparked immediate interest from all three adults. Direct demonstration carried more persuasive power than any amount of testimony, especially when dealing with people whose emotions overruled their rational thinking. What kind of demonstration? Ayana asked. Miss Ayana said she tested water with plants. What if we did the same test where people could see results for themselves? Plant tests take time, she replied thoughtfully, but there are faster ways to show contamination if you know what to look for. She began explaining traditional Apache methods for evaluating water quality, techniques that could reveal contamination through immediate visual changes. Combined with Ezekiel's knowledge of mining processes and Timothy's surprisingly acute observational skills, they began developing a plan that might actually work. We'll need access to both contaminated and clean water sources, Ezekiel said, plus we'll need an audience willing to watch the demonstration. Dr. Hayes would listen, Ayana suggested. He sees children dying and wants to understand causes. Medical training makes him ask questions that others accept without thinking. What about Maria Santos? Broken Arrow added. Mexican families have their own reasons to distrust Anglo authority. If they see proof of deliberate poisoning, they might be willing to stand together against Blackwater. The conversation was developing into something more complex than Ezekiel had originally envisioned. Instead of simply clearing Ayana's name, they were potentially organizing a coalition that could challenge the entire power structure that Blackwater had created. This is getting bigger than just proving innocence, he observed. We're talking about confronting a man who's killed to protect his secrets. That means people are going to die before this ends. People are already dying, Ayana replied quietly. Every day that contaminated water flows, more children sicken. Every day that mercury runs from mine to spring, more families lose children they should not lose. Timothy moved closer to the adults, his young voice carrying conviction that seemed to come from sources beyond his years. Chu, you taught me that some things are worth fighting for even when fighting is dangerous. Isn't saving children's lives one of those things? The question cut through Ezekiel's protective instincts with surgical precision. He had raised Timothy to understand courage and moral responsibility. Now the boy was applying those lessons to circumstances that demanded action despite risk. Fighting to save children is worth any risk, he admitted. But I need to know you understand what we're undertaking. This isn't going to end with simple explanations and peaceful resolutions. I understand, Shu. Sometimes bad people have to be stopped, and sometimes good people get hurt while stopping them. The matter-of-fact acceptance in Timothy's voice reminded Ezekiel that his nephew had already experienced more loss than many adults endured in full lifetimes. The boy understood death, understood injustice, and had chosen to stand against both despite his youth. Then we planned this carefully, Ezekiel said. No unnecessary risks, no heroic gestures, no actions that endanger people we're trying to protect. Over the next several hours, they developed a strategy that combined Apache knowledge, mountain man survival skills, and Timothy's surprising ability to move unnoticed through adult spaces. Broken Arrow would return to the Apache community and gather intelligence about Blackwater's operations. Ayanna and Ezekiel would conduct water testing that could be demonstrated publicly. Timothy would serve as messenger between groups, his youth making him less suspicious to Blackwater's watchers. "When do we start?" Timothy asked as the planning session concluded. "Tomorrow at dawn," Ezekiel replied. "We'll move to a position where we can observe Crimson Wells and identify potential allies." But their departure from the sacred cave was delayed by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Dr. Edmund Hayes appeared at the main entrance shortly after midnight, guided by one of Broken Arrow's cousins, who had been watching for anyone seeking them with peaceful intentions. The physician, a soft-spoken man in his 40s whose medical training had been supplemented by years of frontier experience, brought news that changed everything. "3 more children died yesterday," he reported without preamble, all showing the same symptoms: stomach pain, fever, convulsions, then death. All from families who use the main spring for drinking water. "Mercury poisoning," Ayanna said immediately. "How long between first symptoms and death?" "Approximately 6 hours for each child. Then contamination levels are increasing. Mine is releasing more poison into water supply." Dr. Hayes studied Ayanna with the clinical attention of a medical professional evaluating a colleague. "You really are trained in medicine, aren't you? Carlisle School, then advanced study with Apache healers who understood plant medicine better than most white doctors understand anatomy. Then perhaps you can explain something that's been troubling me. The symptoms I'm seeing don't match any known disease patterns. They do match descriptions of mercury exposure that I remember from medical school. Because that's exactly what you're treating. Judge Blackwater's silver mine is poisoning your patients, and he's using Apache witchcraft to explain away evidence of his crimes." Dr. Hayes absorbed this information with the systematic thinking of someone trained to evaluate evidence objectively. "If you're correct, then I've been treating symptoms while the cause continues to kill children." "Not just children," Ezekiel added. "According to Ayanna, Blackwater has been murdering anyone who threatens to expose the contamination. We're talking about a conspiracy that goes far beyond environmental negligence." "What proof do you have?" "Right now, just testimony and knowledge of mercury mining processes. But we're planning to gather physical evidence that can be demonstrated publicly." "I want to help," Dr. Hayes said without hesitation. "If children are dying from preventable poisoning, stopping that poisoning becomes my primary medical obligation." The addition of a respected white physician to their coalition changed the tactical situation dramatically. Hayes brought credibility with the Anglo community, professional knowledge that complemented their other skills, and access to resources that had been beyond their reach while hiding in the cave. "There's something else," Hayes continued. "Maria Santos asked me to deliver a message if I found you. She says Mexican families are ready to stand together against anyone who murders their children, regardless of consequences." "How many families?" Broken Arrow asked. 23 households, representing nearly 100 people. They've been organizing since Maria's husband died in what Blackwater claimed was a mining accident. Ezekiel felt the situation shifting around them with the momentum of historical forces larger than individual choice. They were no longer simply hiding from injustice. They had become the focal point for a community uprising that had been building pressure for months. "This is bigger than we planned," he said. "We're not just proving innocence anymore. We're organizing a rebellion." "Maybe that's what this situation requires," Ayanna replied. "Sometimes individual justice and community justice point in same direction." Timothy, who had been listening with the intense concentration he brought to all adult discussions, raised his hand like a student seeking permission to speak. "Yes, Timothy?" Ezekiel said. "Chew, if all these people want to help stop bad things from happening to children, doesn't that mean the right thing to do is help them organize to do it safely?" Once again, the boy's moral clarity cut through adult complications with surgical precision. If they had allies willing to risk their lives for justice, abandoning those allies to protect their own safety amounted to moral cowardice. "You're right," Ezekiel said after a long moment of consideration. "If we're going to do this, we do it together and we do it right." As dawn approached through the cave entrance, They finalized plans for emerging from sanctuary to challenge the most powerful man in the territory. The transition from hiding to fighting carried enormous risks, but the alternative, allowing Blackwater to continue murdering children while framing innocent people, had become morally unacceptable. One more thing, Dr. Hayes said as they prepared to leave the sacred ground that had protected them through the night. You should know that Territorial Marshal is scheduled to arrive in Crimson Wells next week. If we can present evidence to federal authority, this situation might be resolved through legal channels rather than violence. Or Blackwater might kill the marshal and claim Apache raiders were responsible, Broken Arrow observed. That's why we need overwhelming evidence and multiple witnesses, Ezekiel said. If we're going to expose this conspiracy, we need to do it so thoroughly that Blackwater can't explain it away. As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave the cave that had become their sanctuary, Timothy took one last look at the ancient pictographs that had watched over their planning. "Chew," he said quietly. "Do you think the Apache spirits approve of what we're doing?" Ezekiel followed his nephew's gaze to symbols whose meanings were lost to time but whose presence conveyed continuity across generations. "I think," he said carefully, "that spirits who protected people seeking justice would understand our choices, even if we're not Apache." Ayana touched one of the painted figures with reverence, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or blessing. "Mountain spirits and Apache spirits serve same purpose," she said. "They guide people who choose difficult paths because those paths lead to right destinations." As they emerged from the cave system into the harsh light of desert dawn, Ezekiel felt the weight of destiny settling around his shoulders like a familiar coat. They were no longer hiding from injustice. They were marching toward confrontation with it. The battle for truth was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of an entire community that had suffered too long under the rule of powerful men who valued profit over human life. The landscape that greeted them outside the sacred cave seemed to have changed during their underground sojourn. The same mesas rose against the same sky, but knowledge of Blackwater's systematic murders had transformed every shadow into potential threat, every distant rider into possible danger. They moved with the careful attention of people who understood that visibility meant vulnerability. Hayes had brought supplies that allowed them to establish a temporary camp in a hidden canyon 3 miles from Crimson Wells. The position provided clear observation of the town's main approaches while offering multiple escape routes if discovery made retreat necessary. Ezekiel's mountain-trained eyes immediately cataloged the tactical advantages: clean water, defensive positions, concealment from casual observation. "Timothy," he said as they established their base camp, "your job is to stay out of sight and keep watch. Anyone approaches who doesn't belong, you signal immediately." "Yes, sir. What's the signal?" 3 owl calls, then 1. Anyone hears that, they know to take cover and prepare for trouble. While Timothy settled into his observation post with the seriousness of a military sentry, the adults began planning their approach to evidence gathering. The direct confrontation Ezekiel had originally envisioned was evolving into something more complex, requiring coordination between multiple groups and careful timing to avoid unnecessary casualties. "First priority is water testing that people can witness," Ayana said, laying out the botanical materials she had gathered during their escape from the cave. "These plants react to mercury contamination within minutes, showing changes that even untrained people can recognize." "Where can we conduct testing safely?" Hayes asked. "Maria Santos owns property near the main spring," Broken Arrow suggested. "Mexican families control that area, and they've been organizing against Blackwater since suspicious deaths started increasing." "Can you arrange a meeting?" Ezekiel asked. "Tonight after dark. Maria says she'll gather families who lost people to Blackwater's operations. Maybe 20 adults, all who understand risks of challenging powerful man." The plan that emerged required careful coordination and considerable trust between groups that had little history of cooperation. Apache knowledge would provide the testing methods, mountain man skills would ensure security, medical training would interpret results, and Mexican families would provide both witnesses and protection during the demonstration. "What about afterward?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Assuming we can prove a contamination, how do we protect people who serve as witnesses?" "That depends on how Blackwater responds." Ezekiel replied grimly. If he tries to silence witnesses with violence, we'll have to be prepared to defend them with violence. You're talking about war. I'm talking about stopping a man who's already at war with anyone who threatens his profits. The only question is whether we fight back or let him continue killing people. Timothy's voice interrupted from his lookout position. Chew, riders coming from the east. 4 men, moving carefully like they're looking for something. Ezekiel immediately shifted to combat alertness, his rifle appearing in his hands with the fluid motion of long practice. The others took cover behind rock formations that provided both concealment and fields of fire. Through his binoculars, Ezekiel studied the approaching riders with professional attention. 4 men in dusty trail clothes, well-armed but not displaying weapons aggressively. Their movement patterns suggested searching rather than attacking, but experience had taught him that appearances could be deliberately deceptive. Can you identify them? Dr. Hayes whispered. Not from this distance, but they're following the trail we used coming out of the cave system. Blackwater's men? Maybe, or maybe someone else looking for us. The riders approached to within 100 yards before stopping at a position that commanded clear views of the surrounding terrain. One man dismounted and began examining tracks with the systematic attention of an experienced tracker. Apache, Broken Arrow said quietly. I recognize the way he reads sign. Friend or enemy? In current situation could be either. The tension stretched for several minutes while the tracker worked and the mounted men maintained vigilant watch. Then the dismounted man straightened and called out in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. Broken Arrow replied in the same language, and after a brief exchange, gestured for the others to show themselves. My cousin from reservation, he explained, as the riders approached their position. Brings news from Apache Council and message for Ayana. The reunion that followed provided their first encouraging news in days. The Apache Tribal Council had been investigating reports of poisoned water affecting reservation families who occasionally traded in Crimson Wells. Their own testing had confirmed contamination, and they were prepared to support any effort to expose the source. More than that, the lead writer, a dignified older man named Grey Wolf, explained in careful English. Federal Marshal arrives in Tucson yesterday. Word is he plans to investigate complaints about territorial law enforcement, including reports about Apache woman tried by desert trial. Federal interest changes everything, DeHaye said immediately. If we can present evidence to federal authority, Blackwater's local influence becomes irrelevant. Only if federal marshal lives long enough to hear evidence, Ezekiel observed. Men like Blackwater don't hesitate to kill federal officers if killing serves their purposes. Then we make our marshal has protection and evidence before Blackwater knows he's investigating, Ayana said. Grey Wolf reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a familiar beaded bag. Found this hidden near reservation boundary. Thought you might want it back. Ayana accepted her medicine bag with hands that trembled slightly. I thought Blackwater's men had destroyed everything. Some things too sacred to destroy. Earth spirits protected your medicine until it could return to proper hands. As Ayana examined the bag's contents, her face showed relief mixed with renewed determination. The plant samples and contaminated water she had collected were still intact, providing the physical evidence they needed to prove their accusations. Now we have proof, she said quietly. Question is how to present it so people believe what they see. Maria Santos is expecting us after sunset, Broken Arrow reminded them. Mexican families want to hear your story and see your evidence. If they're convinced, they'll spread word through community. And if they're not convinced, Timothy asked from his lookout position, then we find another way, Ezekiel replied. But I think people who've lost children to Blackwater's greed will listen to anyone who can explain why their children died. Grey Wolf and his companions departed with promises to maintain watch for federal marshals and to carry word to Apache communities about the planned water testing. Their support provided both additional security and legitimacy that would be crucial when confronting Blackwater's version of events. As evening approached, they prepared for their first public presentation of evidence against one of the territory's most powerful men. The demonstration would either mark the beginning of justice or the start of a war that could consume the entire region. Chew, Timothy said as they gathered their materials for the evening meeting. Are you scared about what might happen? Ezekiel considered the question with the honesty he tried to bring to all conversations with his nephew. Yes, I'm scared, but being scared doesn't change what's right or what's necessary. Is that why you saved Miss Ayana even though it was dangerous? That's exactly why. Sometimes the most important things you do are the things that scare you most. Timothy nodded with the gravity of someone who understood that childhood was ending and adult responsibilities were beginning. As they moved toward their appointment with Maria Santos and the Mexican families who had suffered under Blackwater's regime, Ezekiel felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that preceded significant action. They were about to step from shadows into light, trading safety for the possibility of justice. Whatever happened next would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of a community that had endured injustice for too long. The time for hiding had ended. The time for fighting had begun. The desert evening stretched before them, beautiful and merciless, as they prepared to challenge evil that had wrapped itself in the clothes of law and order. Tomorrow would bring consequences that none of them could fully predict, but tonight would bring the first real test of whether truth could triumph over power. In the distance, the lights of Crimson Wells flickered like stars in the gathering darkness, each one representing lives that hung in the balance of decisions yet to be made. The gathering at Maria Santos's property unfolded under a canopy of stars that seemed to bear witness to human suffering transformed into determination. 23 Mexican families had assembled in the adobe courtyard, their face etched with grief that had hardened into resolve. Children played quietly in the shadows, while their parents listened to testimony that would either vindicate their losses or condemn them to accept inexplicable tragedy. Maria Santos herself commanded immediate respect. A woman in her 40s whose husband's death in Blackwater's mine had left her to raise 4 children alone, she possessed the quiet authority of someone who had learned to lead through necessity rather than ambition. Her courtyard, surrounded by thick adobe walls that muffled sound and blocked observation, provided the perfect venue for dangerous conversations. "We have heard rumors," she said, as Ayana, Ezekiel, Timothy, and Dr. Hayes settled around the central fire. "Stories about Apache women who tried to save our children, about powerful men who kill to protect their secrets. Tonight we want to hear truth, see evidence, decide what Mexican families should do about injustice that takes our children." Ayana stepped forward with her medicine bag, its beaded surface reflecting firelight like captured stars. "I came to Crimson Wells to help sick children, not to hurt them. What I found was poison in the water, and men who preferred to blame Apache magic rather than face responsibility for their crimes." She began the demonstration with movements that spoke of both scientific training and spiritual tradition. Plant specimens were arranged with ceremonial precision, contaminated water samples placed in containers that caught the firelight, clean water from the mountain spring positioned for comparison. "These are tests my grandmother taught me, refined by knowledge learned in white schools," she explained as she prepared the botanical reagents. "Plants that change color when exposed to certain poisons. Ways of reading water's health by watching how living things respond to it." Timothy moved closer to watch, his fascination with the process evident in his concentrated attention. "Miss Ayana, how fast do the plants change?" "Very fast when contamination is strong. Watch." She dipped a sprig of white sage into water taken from Crimson Well's main spring. Within moments, the plant's leaves began turning brown at the edges, the discoloration spreading like a stain across living tissue. "Now watch clean water," she said, repeating the process with spring water from the mountains. The sage remained vibrant green, showing no signs of distress. Murmurs rippled through the assembled families as they witnessed demonstration that required no specialized knowledge to interpret. Plants died in town water, thrived in mountain water. The implication was immediately obvious to people who understood the relationship between environmental health and human survival. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with medical testimony that reinforced what botanical evidence had revealed. "The symptoms I've been treating match mercury poisoning exactly. Stomach pain, fever, convulsions, rapid death, all concentrated in families who use the main spring for drinking water." "But why would anyone poison our water?" asked Carlos Mendez, whose 6-year-old daughter had died the previous month. "What do they gain from killing children?" "They don't gain from killing children," Ezekiel replied. They kill children to hide evidence of crimes that make them rich. Judge Blackwater's silver mine dumps mercury waste into underground streams. When people start dying, he blames Apache witchcraft instead of accepting responsibility. Prove it, Maria said simply. Broken Arrow produced a detailed map drawn on tanned hide, showing water flow patterns from the mining operation to various springs around Crimson Wells. Apache scouts tracked contamination source by following dead fish, poisoned animals, plants that died near water. All led back to Blackwater's mine. More than that, Ayana added, we have evidence of systematic murder. Anyone who threatened to expose truth about poisoned water died in convenient accidents or simply disappeared. Including my husband, Maria said quietly. Pedro asked too many questions about safety procedures at mine. Next day, rockfall killed him and 2 other men who worked with him. The personal testimonies that followed painted a picture of systematic intimidation backed by violence. Families who complained about water quality found their businesses boycotted, their employment terminated, their property threatened. Those who persisted in asking questions often suffered fatal accidents that served as warnings to others. How many people has Blackwater killed to protect his secret? Dr. Hayes asked. At least 15 that we can document, Broken Arrow replied. Probably twice that number if you count deaths made to look like natural causes. Timothy listened to the recitation of murders with the grave attention of someone learning that evil could wear respectable faces. Chew Ezekiel, he said quietly. How can one man kill so many people and nobody stops him? Because he has money, guns, and influence with territorial authorities, Ezekiel replied. And because good people have been fighting alone instead of fighting together. But we're not alone anymore, Maria observed, gesturing toward the families assembled around them. If Mexican families and Apache people and mountain men work together, maybe we become strong enough to demand justice. What kind of justice? Asked Roberto Chavez, whose teenage son had died after drinking contaminated water. Legal justice through courts or frontier justice through guns? The question hung in the fire-lit air like smoke, forcing everyone to confront the reality that legal solutions might prove inadequate for crimes protected by economic and political power. Federal marshal arrives in territory this week, Hayes said. If we can present evidence to federal authority before Blackwater knows investigation is underway, we might achieve justice through legal means. And if federal marshal dies in convenient accident before hearing evidence, Broken Arrow asked, then we protect him the same way we protect our families, Ezekiel replied, with whatever force becomes necessary. As the evening progressed, the coalition that emerged represented unprecedented cooperation between groups that had historically viewed each other with suspicion. Apache knowledge, Mexican determination, mountain man skills, and medical expertise combined to create a force that might actually challenge Blackwater's dominance. But their planning was interrupted by Timothy's urgent whistle from his lookout position. 3 soft hoots, followed by 1 sharp call, the signal for immediate danger approaching. How many? Ezekiel called softly. 8 riders, coming fast from town. They have torches and look angry. And the families immediately shifted into defensive positions with the fluid efficiency of people who had faced violence before. Children were moved to interior rooms, while adults took cover behind adobe walls and prepared weapons that ranged from hunting rifles to farm tools converted for combat. Blackwater's men? Maria asked. Maybe, or maybe townspeople who heard rumors about tonight's gathering. Through gaps in the courtyard wall, they could see the approaching riders clearly. 8 men in trail clothes, heavily armed, moving with the purposeful aggression of people intent on violence. At their head rode a figure in black coat and string tie, whose bearings suggested authority accustomed to being obeyed without question. Judge Blackwater himself, Dr. Hayes identified grimly. This isn't a coincidence. Someone told him about tonight's meeting. Or he has spies watching Mexican families routinely, Ezekiel suggested. Blackwater's voice carried clearly across the night air as the riders approached the compound. Maria Santos, I know you're harboring fugitives and spreading lies about decent men. Send out the Apache witch and mountain man, and we'll discuss this situation reasonably. What he means, Maria replied loudly enough for all to hear, is send them out so he can murder them quietly. Your husband died in mining accident, woman. Don't let grief make you believe Apache lies about good Christian men. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Blackwater offering increasingly elaborate threats disguised as reasonable negotiation. But his ultimate message was clear: surrender the fugitives or face collective punishment for the entire Mexican community. We could slip out the back, Ayana suggested, avoid bloodshed by removing ourselves from situation, and let him burn down everything these families have built, Ezekiel replied. I don't think so. Timothy appeared at his uncle's elbow with the silent movement that had become his trademark. Chew, there are more men moving through the hills. I counted at least 12 additional riders taking positions around the property. The tactical situation had become clear. Blackwater hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to end the growing resistance by destroying its leaders and intimidating its supporters. The adobe walls that provided concealment also created a trap if surrounded by superior numbers. How many fighting men do we have? Ezekiel asked Maria. 15 with military experience, another dozen who know how to use weapons. Not enough to fight 20 armed men in open combat. Then we don't fight in open combat. We use defensive advantages and make them pay for every inch. As they prepared for siege, Timothy made an observation that changed everything. Judge Blackwater, brought something in a wagon. Big wooden barrels, like the ones I saw being loaded with mercury. The implication hit all the adults simultaneously. Blackwater hadn't just brought men and weapons. He had brought the evidence that could prove their accusations about water contamination. If we can capture those barrels intact, Dr. Hayes said, we'll have physical proof that even federal courts would have to accept. Assuming any of us survive to present evidence, Broken Arrow observed. We'll survive, Ezekiel said with quiet conviction, because we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves, and men like Blackwater are only fighting for profit. The siege of Maria Santos's compound began with gunfire that shattered the desert silence like breaking glass. But what Blackwater intended as quick intimidation became protracted combat as the defenders used superior position and desperate motivation to offset their numerical disadvantage. The battle raged through the night with the desperate intensity of people fighting for principles they valued more than life itself. Blackwater's superior numbers were offset by the defenders' knowledge of terrain and their willingness to accept casualties rather than surrender. Every window, every doorway, every gap in the adobe walls became a potential firing position as the siege evolved into a test of endurance rather than overwhelming force. Timothy proved invaluable as a messenger, his small size allowing him to move through the compound unseen while carrying information and supplies between defensive positions. His courage under fire reminded Ezekiel of another child who had faced danger with similar determination, though Sarah McKinnon's battles had been with disease rather than gunmen. Ammunition report, Ezekiel called as dawn approached with the promise of clear visibility that would favor the attackers. Running low, Maria replied from her position covering the main gate. Maybe 2 hours of shooting left at current rate. Water? Plenty. Well is inside compound, and they haven't found way to contaminate it. Food? Enough for days if necessary. The tactical situation was slowly shifting in favor of the defenders despite their ammunition shortage. Blackwater's men had taken casualties without achieving any significant objectives, and their enthusiasm for prolonged combat was visibly declining as the sun rose over terrain that offered them little cover. Judge Blackwater, Ezekiel called during a lull in shooting, your men look tired. Maybe time to discuss terms. Only term is your surrender, McKinnon. Apache witch dies for murdering children, and you die for harboring her. What about evidence that your mine is poisoning the water supply? Interested in letting people see what's in those barrels you brought? The silence that followed lasted long enough to suggest that Blackwater was consulting with his men about options he hadn't expected to consider. You're bluffing, he finally replied. No evidence exists because no crime occurred. Then you won't mind if Dr. Hayes eats those barrels in front of witnesses. Hayes is traitor to his own race. His testimony means nothing. But something in Blackwater's tone suggested that confidence was eroding. The arrival of federal attention, combined with organized resistance from multiple communities, had created circumstances he had never anticipated. Ayana, who had been treating wounded defenders with supplies from her medicine bag, looked up from bandaging Roberto Chavez's arm. He's stalling for reason, maybe waiting for reinforcements, maybe trying to think of way out that doesn't involve admitting guilt. Or maybe, Timothy suggested from his observation post, he's waiting for federal marshal to arrive so he can claim we're dangerous criminals who attacked law-abiding citizens. The possibility hadn't occurred to any of the adults, but it explained Blackwater's willingness to accept a prolonged siege rather than pressing for quick victory. If he could present the federal marshal with evidence of Mexican and Apache violence against white authority, the entire narrative could be reversed. We need to end this before federal marshal arrives, Ezekiel realized. Otherwise, Blackwater controls the story that gets told. How do we end siege when they have us surrounded, Maria asked. By making them want to leave more than we want them to go. Ezekiel began explaining a plan that combined mountain warfare tactics with Apache guerrilla techniques and Mexican knowledge of local terrain. Instead of waiting for attack, they would carry the fight to their enemies using mobility and surprise to offset numerical disadvantage. It's dangerous, he warned. People will die, and we can't predict who or how many. People are already dying, Dr. Hayes replied. At least this way, we die fighting instead of hiding. The breakout began an hour before noon, when the desert heat was beginning to sap strength and attention from men unaccustomed to prolonged exposure. Broken Arrow led the first assault team through passages between buildings that Blackwater's men hadn't thought to guard. Timothy guided the second team through drainage ditches that provided concealment until they reached striking distance. Ezekiel led the frontal assault with the deliberate timing of someone who had learned patience from mountains that measured change in geological epochs. The coordinated attack shattered Blackwater's defensive positions and forced his men into retreat toward terrain that offered no advantage to either side. But victory came at a cost that reminded everyone of war's true price. Carlos Mendez died defending his daughter's memory, shot while charging a position that threatened the compound's main water source. Roberto Chavez fell beside him, killed by men who had never bothered to learn his name. Their sacrifice allowed the breakthrough that turned siege into rout, but the price seemed almost too high for victory to bear. Judge Blackwater's escaping, Timothy called from his pursuit of fleeing enemies. He's heading for the barrels. The wagon containing mercury evidence had become the focal point of a running battle between men who understood that physical proof could determine guilt or innocence in federal court. Blackwater's desperation to destroy evidence was matched by the coalition's determination to preserve it, creating a contest where the stakes far exceeded the apparent value of wooden containers. Ezekiel reached the wagon first, but Blackwater was already there with a torch, preparing to ignite contents that would destroy evidence and probably kill anyone nearby when mercury vapor exploded. "Stop right there, McKinnon," Blackwater shouted, his torch held dangerously close to the wagon's contents. "Come closer, and everybody dies." "Judge," Ezekiel replied calmly, "you're outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by witnesses who've seen enough evidence to convict you in any honest court. Maybe time to consider surrender." "Surrender to Apache-loving traitors? I'd rather die. Your choice. But think about those families who lost children because of mercury you dumped in their water. Don't you owe them truth about how their babies died?" For a moment, something that might have been conscience flickered in Blackwater's eyes. The torch wavered as he looked around at faces that reflected the accumulated grief of parents who had buried children without understanding why death had claimed them. "They died because of Apache witchcraft," he said, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. "They died because mercury is cheaper to dump than dispose of properly," Ayana replied, stepping into the circle of confrontation with her medicine bag held like a shield. "Look at evidence in your own wagon. See what your greed did to innocent children. You stay back, witch. Your magic killed those babies. My medicine saved the babies I could reach. Your poison killed the ones I couldn't save in time." The standoff stretched with the tension of a bowstring drawn to breaking point. Blackwater's torch cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock his claims of righteousness, while mercury barrels waited to explode or testify, depending on decisions made in the next few heartbeats. Dr. Hayes approached from the side with his hands visible and empty. "Judge, as a medical professional, I can examine those barrels and tell you exactly what they contain. If you're innocent, evidence will prove it. If you're guilty, destroying evidence only confirms guilt." "I know what they contain," Blackwater snarled. "Mining supplies, legal materials for legal business." Then let us verify that claim. Open the barrels, let people see contents. Remove all doubt about your innocence. But even as Hayes spoke, Timothy was circling behind Blackwater with the silent movement he had learned from watching Apache scouts. The boy's approach was invisible until the moment he knocked the torch from Blackwater's hand with a perfectly thrown stone. The torch fell harmlessly into sand where it could threaten nothing more dangerous than desert grass. Blackwater spun toward Timothy with a gun that appeared in his hand like magic. But Ezekiel was already moving with the fluid violence of a mountain cat protecting its young. The shot that ended Judge Blackwater's reign of terror echoed across the desert like thunder, followed by silence that seemed to contain the spirits of all his victims, finding peace at last. The arrival of Federal Marshal James Crawford 3 hours later found a scene that would have challenged the interpretive skills of any law enforcement officer. Bodies lay scattered across terrain that showed clear evidence of significant combat, while survivors from multiple ethnic communities worked together to provide medical treatment and preserve evidence with unprecedented cooperation. Marshal Crawford, a weathered man in his 50s whose experience included service in the Civil War and 20 years of federal law enforcement, surveyed the aftermath with professional attention that missed no detail. "Who's in charge here?" he asked as he dismounted near the Mercury wagon that had become the focal point of so much violence. "Nobody's in charge," Ezekiel replied. "We're just people who got tired of watching children die while powerful men protected their profits." "You McKinnon, the mountain man I've been hearing about?" "I am. Word is you interfered with legal execution of Apache woman convicted of murdering children." "Word is accurate. I stopped murder of innocent woman framed by guilty man." Crawford studied the assembled evidence with the systematic attention of someone who understood that federal jurisdiction required federal quality proof. The mercury barrels, Ayana's botanical testing materials, Dr. Hayes's medical records, and testimony from 23 Mexican families created a compelling case that even territorial corruption couldn't easily dismiss. "This Apache woman," Crawford said, indicating Ayana, "she really medicine woman with formal education?" "Carlisle School, then advanced training with traditional healers," she replied. "I can provide documentation if federal authority requires proof of credentials." "I've heard of you, daughter of Cochise lineage, granddaughter of Geronimo. Reputation for healing that crosses cultural boundaries. I try to help anyone who needs healing, regardless of race or politics." Crawford spent the next several hours interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and reconstructing events with methodical precision. His investigation revealed systematic murder conspiracy that extended far beyond simple environmental contamination, involving bribery of territorial officials, intimidation of witnesses, and assassination of anyone who threatened to expose Blackwater's operations. Based on preliminary investigation, he announced as afternoon sun slanted across the compound, federal government will assume jurisdiction over this case. Judge Blackwater's death appears justified given circumstances, and charges against Apache woman appear fraudulent. The relief that followed his declaration was immediate and overwhelming. Families who had suffered in silence finally had validation that their losses resulted from crime rather than natural tragedy. The coalition that had formed around shared grief was transforming into a community united by shared justice. "What happens to mercury contamination?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Mining operation continues to poison water supply while we investigate and prosecute." "A federal authority includes environmental jurisdiction," Crawford replied. "Mine operations cease immediately pending federal investigation of contamination claims." Timothy had been listening to adult conversation with the intense attention he brought to all learning opportunities. "Marshal Crawford, what about the people who helped Judge Blackwater hurt families? Do they get punished too?" "Son, federal justice moves slowly but thoroughly. Everyone who participated in this conspiracy will face appropriate charges once investigation is complete." As evening approached, the Mexican families began preparing a feast that transformed battlefield into celebration. The dead were honored with dignity, while the living acknowledged that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived in a form that even powerful men could not corrupt or intimidate. Ezekiel found himself sitting beside Ayana as sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Timothy played with Mexican children who had accepted him immediately, teaching them English words while learning Spanish phrases with the adaptability that made childhood such a gift. "What happens now?" he asked her. "Now we rebuild." Mexican families reclaim their dignity, Apache people reclaim their water rights, and everyone learns that cooperation creates strength that individual efforts cannot achieve. And us? What happens to us? She looked at him with eyes that held depths he was only beginning to explore. That depends on whether you want to continue living alone or whether he's ready to share his life with someone who understands both healing and loss. The question hung between them with implications that went far beyond immediate circumstances. They had been thrown together by crisis, united by shared danger, and bonded through combat that tested character as thoroughly as any trial could devise. "Timothy would need to approve," Ezekiel said after careful consideration. "Timothy already gave approval. Asked me yesterday if I planned to stay with his family permanently." "What did you tell him?" "Told him family isn't something you plan. Family is something you choose every day, through decisions that prove love is stronger than convenience." As if summoned by their conversation, Timothy appeared at Ezekiel's side with the silent approach that had become his trademark. "Chu, Miss Ayana, can I ask you something important?" "Always," Ezekiel replied. "If Miss Ayana becomes part of our family, does that mean I'll have both mountain knowledge and Apache knowledge to learn from?" "It means you'll have more knowledge than any child in the territory," Ayana answered. "Both traditions teach survival, but they teach different aspects of survival. Together, they create wisdom that neither could achieve alone. Like how we beat Judge Blackwater by working together instead of fighting alone?" "Exactly like that." Marshall Crawford's voice interrupted their family conversation as he approached with documents that required signatures. "Mr. McKinnon, I need formal statements about events leading to today's confrontation. Your testimony will be crucial for federal prosecution of remaining conspiracy members." As Ezekiel provided detailed statements about Blackwater's systematic murders, Ayana's false accusation, and the coalition that had formed to seek justice, he reflected on how much had changed since that morning when he discovered a bound Apache woman dying under the desert sun. The decision to cut those ropes had seemed simple at the time, driven by basic human decency rather than complex political calculations. But that single choice had led to consequences that transformed an entire community and challenged power structures that had seemed unshakable. "One more question," Crawford said as he concluded his interview. "Would you be willing to serve as Deputy Federal Marshal for this territory? Position comes with authority to investigate federal crimes and protect federal witnesses." Ezekiel looked toward Timothy, who was demonstrating Apache words to Mexican children while their parents planned cooperative farming that would benefit everyone. The boy's future seemed brighter in a community where different cultures supported each other rather than fighting for dominance. "I'll consider it," he replied, "but any decision includes consultation with family members who would share the risks." "Fair enough. Think it over and let me know." As official business concluded and celebration began in earnest, the three people who had started this journey as strangers found themselves sitting together while Timothy shared stories about his uncle's mountain wisdom with anyone willing to listen. "Chu," the boy said during a pause in his storytelling, "I figured out something important about what happened." "What's that?" "You always told me family is people who choose to stay together even when staying is dangerous. Today I watched Apache people and Mexican people and mountain people all choose to stay together when staying was very dangerous." "And what did that teach you?" "That family doesn't have to be just blood relations. Family can be anyone who chooses love over safety." Ayana reached for Ezekiel's hand with fingers that still showed rope burns from her ordeal, but moved with the gentle strength of someone who had chosen healing over hatred. "Mountain man," she said quietly, "your nephew understands wisdom that takes most adults' lifetimes to learn." As stars appeared overhead like scattered diamonds, the three people who had found each other through crisis began planning a future that would honor the dead by ensuring that their sacrifice led to lasting justice. The battle for truth had been won, but the work of building a community where truth could flourish would require the same cooperation that had made victory possible. In the distance, the lights of Crimson Wells flickered with promises of renewal rather than threats of destruction. Tomorrow would bring challenges that none of them could fully predict, but tonight brought the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, when good people choose courage over comfort, Justice can triumph over power. The desert wind carried the sound of children's laughter as it rustled through sage and mesquite, creating music that seemed to celebrate the possibility that different peoples could indeed choose to become family when family meant those who stayed together through dangers that tested every bond except love itself. Dr. William Morrison completed his examination of Ezekiel's shoulder as the afternoon sun slanted through windows that had witnessed 27 years of peaceful living. The ranch had prospered during those years, becoming a gathering place where Apache wisdom, Mexican traditions, and mountain knowledge combined to create something stronger than any single culture could achieve alone. Your shoulder shows remarkable healing for such an old injury, Morrison observed as he packed his medical bag. The woman who treated this wound clearly possessed exceptional skill. She possessed something more valuable than skill, Ezekiel replied, settling back into his chair with the satisfaction of a man whose story had finally been told completely. She possessed the courage to heal enemies and the wisdom to transform hatred into understanding. What became of her? She became my wife. Mrs. Ayanna McKinnon has spent 27 years proving that love can bridge any cultural divide if both people are willing to meet halfway. Morrison glanced toward the family photographs that included images of an Apache woman whose beauty had only deepened with age and experience. And your nephew Timothy? Judge Timothy McKinnon serves federal court in Phoenix. Timothy's wife Elena, a teacher he met at the territorial capital, has given him 3 children. Samuel, named for his father, Ayanna, for the woman who saved our family, and Maria, honoring the Mexican families who stood with us. His oldest, Samuel, is studying medicine at Harvard Medical College. All 3 speak Apache, Spanish, and English with equal fluency. A remarkable transformation from the child who hid in caves while his uncle fought for justice. Timothy learned early that survival requires adaptation, and adaptation requires understanding people who seem different but share common needs. Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, but found himself lingering, reluctant to end a conversation that had revealed depths of human experience he had never imagined possible. Mr. McKinnon, may I ask what you consider the most important lesson from everything that happened in 1885? Ezekiel considered the question while gazing toward mountains that had taught him patience and desert that had taught him truth. I learned that family isn't defined by blood or race or culture. Family is defined by people who choose to stay together when staying requires sacrifice. And the Apache woman you saved? What did she learn? That healing works both ways. She saved my shoulder, but more importantly, she saved my ability to trust that life could still offer gifts worth receiving. The sound of approaching wheels interrupted their conversation as a buggy rolled into the ranch yard with familiar efficiency. Timothy McKinnon, now 35 and carrying the dignified bearing of territorial judicial office, stepped down with movements that echoed his uncle's mountain-trained grace. "Uncle Ezekiel," he called in greeting that carried 27 years of accumulated affection. "How are you feeling?" Better for Dr. Morrison's attention and better still for unexpected company. Timothy embraced his uncle with warmth that spoke to bonds deepened rather than weakened by time. "Ayanna sent word that you were having shoulder troubles. Thought I should check on the aging frontiersman." "Where is Ayanna, Henrietta?" Dr. Morrison asked. "Teaching at the school she established for children from all communities," Timothy replied. "Apache, Mexican, white settlers, everyone learning together instead of separately." As if summoned by their conversation, Ayanna appeared from the direction of the schoolhouse. Her hair now silver, but her steps still carrying the confident grace that had attracted Ezekiel's attention decades before. Students followed her like a multicolored parade, their voices calling goodbye in 3 languages as they dispersed toward homes throughout the valley. "Dr. Morrison," she said in greeting, "I hope my husband has been a cooperative patient." "Very cooperative, Mrs. McKinnon, and thank you for allowing me to hear the story of how you met. It explains a great deal about this remarkable community." "The community built itself," she replied. "We simply proved that cooperation creates possibilities that conflict destroys." Timothy settled onto the porch steps where he had learned mountain wisdom as a child. "Uncle, I have news from Phoenix. Federal government is establishing new water protection laws based partly on precedent from the Blackwater case." "Environmental justice?" "Exactly. Industrial operations will be required to prove their activities don't contaminate public water supplies before receiving operating permits." Good. Maybe other communities won't have to fight the battles we fought. The Blackwater mine site has been completely remediated under federal supervision. Clean springs flow again through Crimson Wells, and the memorial garden planted where the old contaminated wells once stood serves as a reminder that environmental justice protects everyone's children. Dr. Morrison gathered his belongings, but found himself reluctant to leave the ranch that had become a living monument to the possibility that justice could triumph over power when good people chose courage over comfort. Mrs. McKinnon, he said, may I ask what you consider the most important lesson from your experiences? That healing requires forgiveness, but forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. We forgave the fear that made people support Blackwater, but we never forgot the necessity of preventing such injustice from recurring. And how do you prevent recurrence? By teaching children that differences in culture, race, and tradition can become strengths instead of sources of conflict. By showing them that family can include anyone willing to choose love over fear. As Dr. Morrison prepared to depart, the three generations represented on the McKinnon Ranch porch created a tableau that seemed to embody hope for human progress. An aging mountain man who had learned to trust again, an Apache woman who had transformed enemies into family, and a territorial judge who carried forward lessons learned in caves where different peoples had chosen cooperation over conflict. Morrison, Ezekiel called as the physician reached his buggy. If you ever need to remember that justice is possible, even when circumstances seem impossible, you're welcome to visit anytime. Thank you, Mr. McKinnon. I suspect I'll remember this conversation for the rest of my life. As the doctor's buggy disappeared down the valley road, three people who had found each other through crisis and chosen each other through love settled into the comfortable silence of family members who understood that the greatest victories weren't won through violence, but through the patient daily choice to build rather than destroy. The desert evening stretched before them, beautiful and peaceful, as children's voices echoed from homes throughout the valley, where Apache, Mexican, and Anglo families had learned that survival required cooperation and prosperity demanded justice for everyone rather than privilege for the few. In the gathering twilight, the McKinnon Ranch stood as proof that sometimes, when circumstances demand impossible choices, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary transformations by choosing love over fear, healing over hatred, and family over the artificial divisions that keep human beings from recognizing their fundamental unity. The story that had begun with an Apache woman dying under the desert sun had ended with a community where children of all backgrounds learned together, where different traditions strengthened rather than threatened each other, and where the definition of family had expanded to include anyone willing to choose loyalty over convenience. As stars appeared overhead like scattered promises, the wind carried the sound of peaceful voices speaking multiple languages, united by common purpose. The eternal human task of creating communities where justice, mercy, and love could flourish together in the harsh but beautiful landscape of the American frontier.